All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're tackling a topic that is pretty much universally challenging for language educators, the nuts and bolts of assessing spoken English. If you've ever found yourself staring down a massive stack of grading rubrics and felt, well, a mild sense of dread, or maybe even a full-on existential crisis when it comes to oral exams, I promise you are absolutely not alone. Today, we're really going to unpack the framework of assessing speech, figure out why it's so incredibly difficult, and most importantly, how we can empower ourselves to do it better.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's just ask the big question. Why are productive skills so much harder to assess? Think about your own classroom. Think about the difference between grading speaking versus grading reading or listening. You probably have a visceral reaction just thinking about it, right? Grading a multiple-choice reading test? Totally straightforward. But grading a 5-minute conversational role play? Wow, that is an entirely different beast.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the speaking assessment challenge. Second, we'll compare receptive and productive skills. Third, we'll break down the 4 core criteria. Fourth, we'll get into giving effective feedback. And finally, we'll look at AI's growing role in testing.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, the speaking assessment challenge.
You know, the breakdown often begins right at the very start of a teacher's career. Pre-service and in-service training programs, they heavily emphasize how to teach English rather than how to assess it. You're taught how to manage a classroom, how to introduce complex grammar, how to set up super engaging activities. But when it comes to the highly technical skill of language assessment, well, a lot of teachers are kind of just left to figure it out on the fly.
And honestly, this validates what pretty much every single teacher feels on a daily basis. Assessing speech is incredibly subjective. You could have 2 different teachers with completely different opinions on a student's fluency or pronunciation. And on top of that, it takes massive amounts of personal time. I mean, if you've got a class of 40 students, giving every single one of them individual, focused attention and feedback on their speaking, that is a monumental logistical challenge.
So what happens? When assessment is avoided just because it's too hard or takes way too long, the fallout is actually pretty alarming. Schools end up with a severe lack of formative assessment. You get this huge imbalance where receptive skills are tested constantly, but productive skills are just ignored. And without that feedback loop, students can't set learning goals. Consequently, they end up graduating with noticeably weaker speaking and writing abilities.
Moving right along to part 2, receptive versus productive skills.
The core conflict really comes down to input versus output. Receptive skills, think reading and listening, they're fundamentally easier to assess because the input is exactly the same for every single test taker. Everyone reads the same exact paragraph. But with productive skills, like speaking and writing, the output wildly varies. Everyone expresses themselves differently. So how on earth do you objectively grade 30 completely different spoken responses to the same prompt? That wildly varied output, that's the absolute crux of the assessment challenge.
Which brings us perfectly to part 3, the 4 core criteria.
Now, examiners for major standardized tests, they definitely don't just rely on a gut feeling. They rely on 4 very specific pillars: fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. By breaking speech down into these isolated categories, examiners can actually impartially judge spoken English. It's like a giant puzzle. A student might have terrible grammar, but absolutely excellent pronunciation and lexical resource. Having this framework prevents one weak area from entirely tanking the student's overall score.
Let's put this into practice with part 4, giving effective feedback. So, how do you actually transform vague feedback into an actionable step for fluency and coherence? Well, instead of just saying something like, try to speak more smoothly, give them a specific mechanical tool. Tell them to practice using linking words. Words like however, on the other hand, or as a result. This bridges the gap between identifying an awkward pause and actually giving the student a concrete way to fill it.
And telling a student to simply use better vocabulary is, well, it's pretty unhelpful, right? Instead, you want to tackle lexical resource by giving them direct, elevated alternatives. Take a word they already know, like job, and arm them with profession, occupation, and career. You are actively mapping basic vocabulary to advanced vocabulary for them right there.
Now, when you're handling grammatical range, ditch the red ink. Instead of just saying fix your grammar, point your students towards specific, complex structures. Directing a student to practice a relative clause, like the city, which I visited last year, was beautiful, that gives them a crystal clear grammatical target to aim for in their very next speaking exercise.
This next part is perhaps one of the most important mindset shifts for student confidence. Effective pronunciation feedback reassures the student that their native accent is perfectly fine. We are absolutely not trying to erase their identity here. The true goal is intelligibility. You really want to redirect their effort away from trying to sound exactly like a native speaker and push them toward highly actionable mechanical skills. Things like stressing keywords and using rising and falling intonation.
To make all of this feedback actually happen, your classroom dynamics probably need to shift. You really must become a facilitator. And what does that mean? It means significantly reducing teacher talking time, or TTT. You just have to let the students talk. That means letting go of the fear of a noisy, seemingly chaotic classroom. If they're speaking and using the target language, let them go. Listen closely and get your specific feedback ready.
And finally, Part 5, AI's role in testing.
We are currently looking at a massive disruption via computer-assisted language testing, or CALT. AI is rapidly changing the landscape by offering benefits human teachers simply cannot match at scale. We're talking real-time assessment, instantaneous detailed feedback, and adaptive testing that literally changes difficulty based on the student's previous answer. It provides uniform, objective assessment across thousands of students simultaneously, and honestly, it does it very cost-effectively.
So, I'm going to leave you with this somewhat provocative question to think about. If AI can perfectly grade fluency, map lexical resources, and provide instant pronunciation feedback, what is your role? I'd argue it pushes us toward the truly human elements of teaching: empathy, motivation, cultural nuance, and building the actual confidence a student needs to use their language in the real world. Think about how your role evolves in tomorrow's tech-driven classroom. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep empowering your students' voices.